Hi guys, in this video I provide an introduction to the while loop. I go over the syntax and I provide an example. Let's start out with the syntax. The syntax of the while loop is very similar to an if statement. If you recall, an if statement starts with the if keyword followed by an expression. This expression is evaluated to true or false. If it is true, the statements in the following block are executed. If it is false, it simply skips that code block and continues execution after the if statement. Now, there's just one syntactical difference between an if statement and the while loop, and that is the if keyword is replaced with the while keyword. It also works very similar, but there's one key difference. Now, the way the while loop works, it evaluates the expression to true or false. If it is true, the statement or statements in the following code block are executed. And after the last statement is executed, the while loop will go and check the expression a second time. It will then, if it's true, execute these statements again and check it a third time. And then, if it's still true, execute the statements and checks it a fourth time, and so on. So we'll always recheck the expression as long as the expression is true. Once the expression becomes false, it will simply skip these statements in the code block and continue the execution after the while loop. Now, if there's no code block here, it simply associates the very first statement after the while loop. And if this expression is true, it will execute the very first statement. Most of the time, it's really good to define your code block, to be explicit about it, what statements should be associated with the while condition up here. Now, I mentioned that after executing the statements in the code block, it will check the expression again. So how can this expression change from being true to false? The only way to do this is by having a statement that affects the expression. Typically, the expression is a condition that checks some variable value. So it's important that we have a statement that updates that variable's value. Let's take a look at an example. Let's say I have a variable named option of type in. I prompt the user to enter an option between 1 and 3. I read that option into the variable. And now I want to perform input validation. At first, let me use an if condition. I check if the option is less than 3 or larger than, if less than 1 or larger than 3. If this is the case, I output invalid input. Please try again. And then I copy these two statements to read that input a second time. When I run this program, I can enter an option. Let's say I use an invalid option, which is 5. It gets evaluated. I get prompted again. Now, if I enter an invalid option a second time, it no longer validates the input. And if I have my program here with statements, it will execute the program with invalid input. Now, in order to fix this, I simply replace the if keyword with the while keyword. Now what will happen is, when I run my program and I enter an invalid input a second time, it will validate it again. It will check this condition again. This is still true, so it's still invalid input. So I get prompted over and over again. As long as I enter an invalid input, I will be stuck in this loop. As soon as I enter a valid input, this condition will become false, because now it is either 1, 2, or 3. It will stop entering the block and execute the statements here. And then it will then continue the execution after the code block. So when I hit enter, it ran until the end. Now, this statement here is very critical, because this is the statement that reads a new value into my variable option. And this affects the condition up here. This is the variable I used in this condition. So if I hadn't done this, the condition would always be true. It could never change. So it's always important that when you write a loop, that you have one statement that affects this condition, so that the condition eventually becomes false. If you don't have a statement that affects the condition will always remain true, and you have an infinite loop that runs forever. Now, this may be useful if you're in a cold room with a broken heater. You could use your computer to spin cycles and heat up. But for the most part, for the programming part, you never want to have this. You always want to have a loop that eventually becomes false, at least most of the time. So whenever you write a loop, make sure to double check that you have a statement that affects this condition and that the condition eventually becomes false. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.